"How does a dead woman know your name?" Marlene Price asked. Nathan stared at the envelope pulled from behind the old brick oven. Atlas sat at his boot, rain dripping from his muzzle, as if he had been guarding the secret all along. On the paper, "For Nathan Brooks when he is ready." "I don't know her," Nathan said, but his voice didn't believe him. Inside was a photograph from 4 years earlier. A wet bus bench, a man with no place to go, and a German shepherd at his feet. Nathan's hand went cold. To understand why, we have to go back to the day he inherited Bellamy's hearth. Nathan Brooks arrived in Laurel Bend with one canvas duffel bag, a tired German shepherd at his side, and a legal envelope he had not yet found the courage to open twice. The bus left him in front of a sun-faded station just after 3 in the afternoon, when Tennessee heat still clung to the sidewalks and magnolia blossoms dropped their sweet, heavy scent into the air like old perfume. He stood there for a moment, 42 years old, shoulders squared by habit, eyes narrowed against the light, looking less like a man beginning a new chapter than one trying not to disturb the dust of the last one. Atlas sat beside his boot without command. The shepherd's sable coat had silver threaded through the muzzle now, and one ear tipped slightly when he listened, giving him the look of an old officer who had seen enough of the world to stop being impressed by it. Nathan glanced down at him. "Don't look at me like that," he murmured. "I didn't ask for a bakery." Atlas blinked once, patient and unconvinced. 3 days earlier, Nathan had been in a rented room outside Knoxville, fixing a loose sink for a landlord who paid in cash and forgot his name by sunset, when a lawyer called to say a woman named Margaret Bellamy had passed away and left him her property on Magnolia Street. Nathan had asked the obvious question. The lawyer had answered with the kind of pause that makes a man feel even farther from the truth. "Mr. Brooks," he'd said, "I handled Mrs. Bellamy's affairs for 17 years. I never heard her mention you until the will." Now Nathan crossed the quiet main street of Laurel Bend with that envelope folded in his jacket pocket, though the day was too warm for a jacket, and his shirt was already damp at the collar. The town looked like a place that had learned to age gently. Brick storefronts, green awnings, a barbershop pole turning lazily, a hardware store with rocking chairs out front, and people who looked up just long enough to notice a stranger, but not long enough to be rude. Nathan disliked that most of all. Suspicion he understood, pity he could endure. Curiosity dressed as kindness made him want to turn around. Atlas, however, seemed to approve of Laurel Bend. He sniffed the curb, the flower beds, the newspaper stand, the warm metal legs of a bench, then lifted his nose toward the far end of Magnolia Street, as if someone there had called his name. That was where Nathan saw it. Bellamy's hearth. The bakery sat in the last patch of afternoon light, a narrow red brick building, tucked between an empty tailor shop and an old bookstore with painted windows. The sign above the door had once been cream-colored, maybe cheerful, but 14 months of weather had worn it down to a tired whisper. Ivy climbed one side of the wall. Dust filmed the front glass. A paper notice inside read "Closed until further notice," though time had curled the edges until the words looked embarrassed to still be there. Nathan stopped at the curb. He had inherited buildings before, only in daydreams, and in those daydreams they came with fresh paint, solid roofs, and keys that opened something better than more responsibility. This place looked like a bill with windows. "Well," he said softly, "that answers that." He reached into his pocket, took out the envelope, and unfolded the handwritten note one more time. No greeting, no explanation, just one sentence pressed into the paper with a careful hand. "Please don't sell the bakery. Stay for 90 days, and you'll understand why I chose you." Nathan read it again, though the words had not changed. Chose you. There were phrases a man could carry like a stone in his chest, and that was one of them. He had spent the last 4 years learning how little the world needed him. Once his service record became a folder in someone else's cabinet. He knew how to be useful. He knew how to be steady, but chosen? That was a word for other people. Atlas stepped forward before Nathan did. The shepherd climbed the single cracked step, lowered his nose to the gap beneath the door, and went perfectly still. Not alert in fear, not excited. Listening. Nathan slid the key into the lock. It resisted, then turned with a dry little click. When he pushed the door open, the brass bell above it rang once, small and clear, and the sound moved through the empty bakery like someone saying welcome after a long silence. Warm air drifted out, carrying the faintest trace of flour, old wood, cinnamon, and something Nathan could not name because memory often arrives before language does. Atlas crossed the threshold, padded straight to the center of the room, and sat down. Nathan remained at the door. Behind the glass cases, the shelves were bare. Chairs rested upside down on tables. A blue apron hung from a hook near the back as if its owner had stepped away for 5 minutes and forgotten to return. On the wall behind the counter, someone had painted in faded black letters, "Coffee is $2, conversation is free." Nathan gave a humorless breath. That's a terrible business model. But his voice came out lower than he meant it to. Atlas did not move. The dog's eyes were fixed on the floorboards beneath the counter, where a thin seam of wood sat slightly raised from the rest. Nathan noticed it only because Atlas noticed it first. He stepped inside, let the door swing shut behind him, and the bell gave one last trembling note. Outside, Laurel Bend kept breathing in the late spring heat. Inside, Nathan Brooks stood in a dead woman's bakery, holding a mystery he did not want, beside a dog who already seemed to know they had not come here by accident. Nathan did not step fully into Bellamy's hearth at first. He stood just inside the door, with one hand still resting on the brass handle, as if leaving it there meant leaving himself an escape. The bakery was quiet in a way that felt different from empty rooms he had known before. It did not feel abandoned exactly. It felt paused. The kind of pause that comes when someone has been interrupted in the middle of a sentence, and everyone is still waiting for them to finish. Atlas sat near the counter, his tail curled around one back leg, watching the floorboards with the solemn patience of a creature that understood waiting better than most men. Nathan looked at him and almost smiled. Almost. "You planning on buying the place?" he asked. Atlas gave a soft exhale through his nose. It was not quite a sigh, but Nathan had lived beside the dog long enough to hear meaning in small sounds. 7 years together had taught him that Atlas rarely wasted movement. He did not bark at passing trucks, did not chase squirrels, did not beg for food unless Nathan had forgotten to eat too. He simply noticed things. The tightness in Nathan's hands before Nathan noticed it himself. The quick shift in his breathing when a room became too crowded. The way silence could sometimes weigh more than noise. Nathan had never called Atlas a rescue dog, though people used that phrase when they saw the vest folded in his duffel bag or watched the shepherd lean his shoulder against Nathan's knee in public places. The truth was less clean. Nathan had found Atlas through a veteran support program 4 years earlier, when both of them were too proud to admit they needed anybody. Atlas had been retired from service work after a hip injury slowed his gait. Nathan had been retired from a life where every hour came with orders, purpose, and a reason to keep moving. One had a limp no one could miss. The other carried his limp somewhere deeper. They recognized each other immediately. Not with drama, not with music swelling in the background. Just a quiet look across a training room in Chattanooga, where Atlas ignored every other handler, crossed the floor, and placed his head against Nathan's thigh like he had been searching for that exact place to rest. Since then, the dog had followed him through motel rooms, bus stations, temporary jobs, cheap coffee, long nights, and mornings when getting out of bed felt less like waking up and more like negotiating with gravity. Nathan had served as an army medic, though he did not offer that detail unless asked directly. People heard veteran and tried to fill in the blanks with movies, flags, speeches, and sorrow they could understand from a safe distance. Nathan disliked being turned into a symbol. He had never wanted applause. He had wanted ordinary things, a working truck, a mailbox with his name on it, a kitchen where he could leave a mug in the sink and know he would come back to it. But ordinary life, he had learned, could be the hardest country to re-enter. In uniform, people had known what to do with him. Out of it, they looked at him like a man who had arrived late to his own future. Atlas was the only one who never asked him to explain himself. When Nathan spoke, the dog listened. When Nathan went silent, the dog stayed. That had become their agreement. No pity, no speeches, just presence. Nathan walked deeper into the bakery, boots making dull sounds against the old wooden floor. Dust rose in the shafts of sunlight slanting through the front windows. On the counter sat a ceramic tip jar with a faded yellow ribbon tied around its neck. Beside it was a stack of napkins, still squared, still waiting for hands that had stopped coming. Nathan touched the edge of the counter and felt grooves worn into the wood by years of elbows, coins, paper bags, maybe grief. He tried to imagine Margaret Bellamy standing there, pouring coffee for strangers, laughing with regulars, knowing everyone's usual order. The image refused to sharpen. To him, she was still only a name on legal paper, and a sentence that made no sense. 90 days, he muttered. Lady, I don't even keep socks that long. Atlas finally moved. He rose slowly, walked to Nathan, and pressed his head into Nathan's palm. It was such a simple gesture that Nathan's throat tightened before he could stop it. He scratched behind the dog's ear, where the fur was thickest and softest. Yeah, he whispered, I know. What he knew was not that they should stay. Not yet. What he knew was that Atlas had felt something in this place Nathan was not ready to feel. Safety, maybe. Or memory. Or the faint outline of a home before a man had the courage to call it that. Upstairs, the apartment waited with its narrow bed, old curtains, and a window overlooking Magnolia Street. Downstairs, the loose floorboard waited beneath the counter. And somewhere inside the walls of Bellamy's hearth, Margaret Bellamy's reason waited too, patient as bread rising in the dark. Nathan told himself he would sleep one night, inspect the property in the morning, and call the lawyer about selling by the end of the week. But when he locked the front door and heard the bell tremble above him, he did not feel like a man leaving a building. He felt, strangely and unwillingly, like someone had closed the door behind him so the world outside could not take him away too soon. Morning found Nathan before he was ready for it. Sunlight slipped through the thin curtains of the apartment above the bakery and laid a pale gold stripe across the floor, touching the edge of his duffel bag, the toe of one boot, then Atlas's sleeping muzzle. For a few seconds, Nathan forgot where he was. That happened sometimes in unfamiliar rooms. His mind reached backward for the shape of yesterday, for the rented room outside Knoxville, for the bus station, for any place that made more sense than waking above a dead woman's bakery, in a town that knew how to look at strangers without saying too much. Then the floorboards gave a soft creak beneath him and memory returned in pieces. Laurel Bend, Magnolia Street, Margaret Bellamy. 90 days. Atlas opened one eye as if he had been waiting for Nathan to catch up. Don't start, Nathan said, pushing himself upright. The apartment was small but stubbornly clean. A narrow kitchen sat against one wall, its cabinets painted a faded butter yellow. A chipped mug rested beside the sink. There was a rocking chair near the window with a folded quilt over its back, and on the sill, 3 dry clay pots where herbs had once grown. Nothing valuable, nothing dramatic. But everywhere Nathan looked, there were signs of a life paused carefully rather than ended. A book turned face down on a side table, a pair of reading glasses in a dish, a recipe card tucked under a magnet shaped like Tennessee. He did not touch those things at first. Personal belongings had a way of accusing a man without meaning to. Downstairs, the bakery waited in softer light than the evening before. The front windows, dusty as they were, caught the morning sun and broke it into long, warm panels across the floor. Nathan unlocked the door to let in air, and the scent of magnolia drifted inside, mixing with old flour, wood polish, and the faint sweetness that seemed to live permanently in the walls. Laurel Bend was already awake. A delivery truck hummed past. Somewhere down the street, a woman laughed outside the diner. The clock above the bakery counter had stopped at 6:17. But outside, time kept moving with no respect for the rooms it left behind. Atlas padded slowly through the shop, nose low, making his own inspection. Nathan followed with a notepad, because practical things were easier than emotional ones. Cracked front glass, he wrote. Water stain near back wall, loose floorboard by counter, oven condition unknown, roof questionable. He paused and looked around. Whole building questionable, he added. The place seemed to hear him. An old pipe knocked once inside the wall, offended. Nathan gave a quiet breath that was almost a laugh. Behind the counter, he found rows of labeled tins: flour, sugar, oats, cinnamon, cornmeal. Most were empty, but when he opened the cinnamon tin, the smell rose so suddenly and richly that something in his chest shifted. Not memory exactly. More like the body remembering comfort before the mind had permission to. Atlas lifted his head. Yeah, Nathan said softly. I smell it too. On the back wall, beneath the painted words "Coffee is $2. Conversation is free," hung a framed photograph of Margaret Bellamy. Nathan had expected someone stern, maybe proud, the kind of woman who left instructions in wills and trusted strangers to obey them. Instead, the woman in the photo had kind eyes, silver hair pinned loosely, and a smile that looked tired at the edges but real in the center. She stood behind this same counter holding a tray of bread, her apron dusted white, her hands strong and square. Nathan looked at the picture longer than he intended. "Why me?" he asked her. The photograph did not answer, but Atlas did something then. He walked to the far corner where a small round table sat alone beneath a window, placed his paw gently on the chair leg, and looked back. Nathan crossed the room. On the tabletop, beneath a film of dust, someone had carved a tiny line into the wood, "Sit here when the world gets loud." The words were small enough to miss, worn enough to have been touched by many fingers. Nathan stood very still. He thought of waiting rooms, bus stations, crowded job offices, polite conversations that made him feel more alone than silence ever had. He thought of all the places a person could be surrounded and still have nowhere to set down the weight inside them. Slowly, he pulled out the chair and sat. Atlas eased himself under the table, resting his head across Nathan's boot. For the first time since arriving, Nathan did not think about selling. He did not think about money, repairs, lawyers, or the 90 days waiting like a dare. He only sat in a patch of Tennessee sunlight, inside a bakery that seemed less like property now, and more like an old heart still trying to beat. Nathan meant to spend the morning making a list of reasons the bakery could not be saved. That seemed safer than wondering why a woman with kind eyes in a dusty photograph had trusted him with it. He found a broom in the back closet, a bucket under the sink, and an old radio on a shelf that still worked after 2 hard taps and a turn of the knob. Soft country music filled the room, thin with static, the kind of sound that belonged to open windows and slow afternoons. Atlas lay near the counter, watching him sweep as if supervising a man too proud to admit he did not know where to begin. Dust gathered in gray little drifts. Sunlight caught Flour still sleeping in the cracks of the floorboards. Every motion brought some forgotten smell back to life. Yeast, sugar, lemon oil, coffee grounds, rain and old wood. Nathan told himself smell was not memory, smell was chemistry. But when he opened a lower cabinet and found a stack of brown paper bags stamped with Bellamy's hearth, something inside him softened before he could defend against it. Each bag had a small line printed beneath the logo, "Take what you need, leave what you can." "That's not accounting," he muttered. Atlas thumped his tail once. Near noon, while Nathan was wiping the front glass, the shepherd rose suddenly, not fast, not startled, just certain. He crossed behind the counter and lowered his nose to the raised seam in the floor Nathan had noticed the night before. Then he pawed at it, gentle at first, then with more insistence. "Atlas." Nathan turned, rag in hand. "Leave it." The dog paused, looked at him, and pawed again. There were very few arguments Nathan had ever won with Atlas when the dog believed he was right. Nathan crouched beside him. The board looked ordinary, except for one nail that had been replaced with a small brass screw. He fetched a screwdriver from the utility drawer, worked the screw loose, and lifted the board. Beneath it, tucked into the shallow space between joists, sat a rectangular tin box the color of old rain. For a while, Nathan only stared at it. Hidden things had a gravity of their own. Atlas sat close enough that his shoulder pressed against Nathan's arm. "You found it," Nathan whispered, though he did not yet know what it was. The lid opened with a soft scrape. Inside lay a leather-bound notebook, several folded receipts tied with blue thread, and a small envelope filled with photographs. The notebook's cover had cracked at the corners. Across the front, in Margaret Bellamy's careful hand, were 3 words: "The Kindness Ledger." Nathan expected numbers. Names, maybe. Debs, something practical. Instead, the first page held a sentence written in dark blue ink. "If someone is hungry, feed them. If someone is proud, feed them quietly." He read it twice. The entries that followed were dated, but not like business records. April 12, 2 loaves left for Mr. Harlan after his shop hours. No note. He would return them if he knew. May 3, coffee for the night nurses. Tell them it was an order mistake. June 19, paid Mrs. Bell's water bill through the office. Do not mention it. July 7, Sam fixed the back sink. Paid him double. Let him call it honest work. Page after page, Margaret had recorded kindness the way other people recorded profit. Not for praise, not for memory alone. For care. Each line seemed built around the same quiet rule: help without making the person feel small. Nathan's thumb stopped on one phrase repeated in the margin so often it felt like prayer. No charge. Let them keep their dignity. He leaned back against the counter. The bakery seemed different around him now, as if the walls had been listening all along and were relieved to finally be understood. Atlas lowered his head onto Nathan's knee. For years, Nathan had believed being useful meant carrying weight until no one noticed he was tired. But Margaret had known another kind of usefulness. A loaf of bread left without a name, a bill paid without applause, a cup of coffee offered as if it were extra, not charity. He looked toward the front windows, where Laurel Bend moved past in the mild spring heat, unaware that beneath an old floorboard lived a map of its own tenderness. Nathan closed the ledger carefully, but he did not put it back. Some things, once found, refused to be hidden again. By late afternoon, the news had begun moving through Laurel Bend the way weather moved over low hills. Quietly at first, then everywhere. Nathan Brooks had opened the front door of Bellamy's Hearth, and that was enough to make people slow their steps along Magnolia Street. They did not rush inside. Small towns had manners about grief, and Bellamy's Hearth still wore Margaret's absence like a black ribbon no one had taken down. Nathan noticed them from behind the counter while pretending not to. A woman paused beneath the awning, touched the glass with 2 fingers, then walked on. A man in a seed company cap stood across the street for nearly a minute before turning toward the diner. 2 older ladies passed by arm in arm, lowered their voices, and looked at the sign as if it might suddenly light again. Atlas noticed too. The shepherd lay near the door, head between his paws, eyes following each passerby with calm attention. He did not bark. He seemed to understand this was not a place people entered casually anymore. The first one to come in was Earl Whitman, owner of the clock repair shop 3 doors down. Nathan knew this because Earl introduced himself before the bell had finished ringing. He was tall and narrow, with careful hands and a face mapped by sun and patience. "You're the man Margaret chose," he said, not as a question. Nathan wiped his palms on a towel. Apparently, Earl glanced around the bakery, and the toughness in his mouth loosened. "Smells like her in here." Nathan almost said he had not baked anything, but he understood what Earl meant. Some people left behind perfume. Margaret had left behind cinnamon and mercy. Earl stepped toward the counter, stopped when Atlas lifted his head, then smiled. "Handsome fellow, Atlas," Nathan said. "He's better company than I am." "Most dogs are," Earl replied, and the simplicity of it made Nathan like him despite himself. Earl ran 1 finger along the counter's edge. "After my wife passed, I closed my shop for 6 weeks. Thought I was done with all of it. Clocks, customers, mornings. Then every Tuesday a loaf of rye appeared by my back door, still warm, no note, no knock. I knew it was Margaret, of course. But she denied it so beautifully I let her keep the lie." His eyes shone, but he did not look away. Nathan respected that. Before he could answer, the bell rang again, and Ruth Palmer from the diner entered carrying 2 iced teas in paper cups. She was broad-shouldered, silver-haired, and had the steady expression of a woman who had fed half the town and forgiven the other half. "Figured you'd forget to drink," she said, setting 1 cup on the counter. Nathan looked at the tea. "I didn't order that." "No," Ruth said. "That's how neighbors work." She noticed the ledger lying open beside the register. Her face changed, not surprise exactly, recognition. "She kept records, not the usual kind," Nathan said. Ruth leaned closer but did not touch the book. "That sounds like Margaret. She never asked people if they needed help. Too many folks would rather sink than admit they're tired. She'd just say she made extra. Extra soup, extra rolls, extra coffee. Everybody knew she was lying. Everybody was grateful she lied kindly." Later came Sam Ortega, the plumber whose name Nathan had seen in the ledger. He arrived to check the back sink and insisted it would be a quick look. He was 45 with work boots, quiet eyes, and a wedding ring worn thin from years of labor. When Nathan mentioned payment, Sam shook his head. "Margaret paid me double once when I couldn't get steady jobs. Claimed the pipe under her sink was possessed. There was nothing wrong with it." He looked toward the old kitchen. "She gave me work when charity would have embarrassed me." That sentence stayed with Nathan after Sam left. Work when charity would have embarrassed me. By evening, Grace Holloway, the retired librarian, came in with a folder of newspaper clippings. She placed them on the counter as if returning something sacred. "Margaret believed every town needed 1 room where nobody had to perform being fine," Grace said. This was hers. Nathan looked around at the empty tables, the dusty cases, Atlas resting near the door like a quiet guardian. For the first time, he saw not what the bakery had been, but what people had carried out of it. Steadier hands, fuller stomachs, a little less loneliness folded into brown paper bags. Everyone knew a piece of Margaret. No one had known all of her, and somehow, impossibly, she had left the whole unfinished picture to him. Nathan told himself he was opening Bellamy's hearth for practical reasons. A building needed air, pipes needed running. People wandering in and out might tell him whether the oven still worked, whether the roof had always complained in the rain, whether Margaret had kept spare keys somewhere sensible, instead of hiding them like prayers beneath floorboards. That was what he told himself when he wiped down the tables, washed the front windows, and turned the old sign from closed to open with a reluctance so careful it nearly looked like avarice. He did not bake at first. Baking felt too personal, too close to trespassing, so he made coffee. Bad coffee, as it turned out. The first pot came out bitter enough to make Ruth Palmer from the diner cough into her paper napkin and say, "Well, you've made something strong enough to patch a tire." Nathan stared at the pot like it had betrayed him. Atlas, lying beside the counter, lifted his head with the grave expression of a judge hearing final testimony. "Nobody asked you," Nathan muttered. Ruth laughed, not loudly, not cruelly, just enough to loosen the room. "Margaret burned her first batch of biscuits when she opened this place," she said. "Told everyone they were rustic." Nathan looked toward Margaret's photograph on the wall. "She got away with that?" "For about 10 minutes. Then she served pie, and everyone forgave her." By noon, 3 people had come in, though none seemed to know what to do with themselves once they crossed the threshold. Earl Whitman sat at the little table near the window, where the words, "Sit here when the world gets loud," were carved into the wood. He ordered coffee and paid with exact change, then sat quietly with both hands around the cup, as if warmth could be measured through porcelain. Sam Ortega came by to check the back sink again. Though Nathan suspected the sink was fine and Sam simply wanted an excuse to stand in the kitchen where Margaret used to hum. Grace Holloway brought a stack of old paperbacks and placed them on the shelf near the door. "Every place that offers coffee should offer second chances," she said, smoothing the covers with one hand. Nathan did not know what to say to that, so he said, "Thank you." It came out rougher than he intended. In the afternoon, he found Margaret's recipe box beneath the register. The cards were stained, bent, and written in a hand that grew less patient near the margins. Cinnamon bread, lemon pound cake, buttermilk biscuits. On the back of one card beneath a recipe for honey rolls, Margaret had written, "Don't rush the dough. People are the same." Nathan stood there longer than a recipe card deserved. He thought about how many times people had tried to hurry him back into being fine. Forms, appointments, well-meaning questions. Advice offered by people who wanted pain to follow a schedule because uncertainty made them uncomfortable. Atlas came to stand beside him, shoulder brushing his leg. "You think she knew everything?" Nathan asked. The dog gave a soft huff. "Yeah, me neither." He tried the cinnamon bread because it looked simple. It was not simple. The dough stuck to his fingers, the counter, the bowl, and somehow the front of his shirt. He added too much flour, then not enough patience. The first loaf came out dense in the center and too dark at the edges. Nathan set it on the cooling rack and folded his arms. "That," he said, "is a brick with cinnamon." Atlas sniffed it, sneezed once, and walked away. Still, when a woman in a postal uniform came in near closing, tired-eyed and sunburned at the neck, Nathan sliced the least damaged end of the loaf and put it on a plate beside her coffee. "Testing a recipe," he said before she could refuse. "You'd be doing me a favor." She hesitated, pride and hunger passing quietly across her face like 2 shadows crossing the same field. Then she sat. "Well," she said after a bite, "it's not pretty." Nathan nodded. "That seems fair, but it tastes like somebody tried." The words landed gently, and somehow that made them harder to bear. More people came the next day. Not many, just enough to give the room a pulse. Nathan learned to offer without cornering. He learned not to ask, "Do you need help?" when someone's hands trembled over their wallet. He learned to say, "Made extra," or "That one cracked, can't sell it," or "First refills free because I forgot to make rules." Each little lie felt like borrowing Margaret's language until his own could carry kindness without making noise. By the end of the week, the bakery still needed repairs, the coffee still needed mercy, and Nathan still intended, at least on paper, to speak with the lawyer about selling. But every morning, when he unlocked the door and Atlas took his place near the entrance, the room seemed to exhale. And Nathan began to understand that Bellamy's hearth had never been important, because people came there to buy bread. It mattered because they were allowed to enter without explaining why they were tired, sit without being measured, and leave with something warm in their hands that did not feel like charity. The offer came on a Thursday morning, folded inside a cream envelope so clean it looked out of place on Margaret Bellamy's worn counter. Nathan had just opened the front door, and Atlas had taken his usual position near the entrance, stretched halfway in a square of sunlight with his chin resting on his paws. The bakery smelled faintly of coffee, cinnamon, and the second attempt at honey rolls cooling near the stove. They were still uneven, but no longer embarrassing enough to apologize for. Nathan was learning that improvement often arrived quietly, without ceremony, like a person slipping into the last pew of a church. The man who delivered the envelope introduced himself as Daniel Kessler. He was about 50, dressed in a gray suit too expensive for Magnolia Street, and carrying the calm smile of someone who had never needed to raise his voice to get what he wanted. "Mr. Brooks," he said, extending a hand, "I appreciate you meeting with me." Nathan shook it because manners were still manners, even when instinct told him to keep both hands free. "I didn't know we had a meeting." Daniel's smile did not move. "Fair enough. I was hoping for a conversation." Atlas lifted his head. He did not growl. He simply watched. Daniel glanced toward the dog, then back at Nathan. "Beautiful shepherd." "He knows," Nathan said. "Knows what?" "When people start with compliments because they're about to ask for something." For the first time, Daniel's smile became real. "Then he's sharper than most board members I've met." Nathan almost liked him for that, which made him trust him less. Daniel placed the envelope on the counter and slid it forward with 2 fingers. "My firm has been investing in Laurel Bend's downtown corridor. New storefronts, improved parking, better foot traffic. We believe this block has potential." Nathan looked through the front window at Earl Whitman unlocking his clock shop, at Ruth Palmer carrying a box of produce into the diner, at Grace Holloway taping a book club notice to the library door. Potential, he had learned, was a word people used when they were trying not to say replacement. "And Bellamy's hearth?" Nathan asked. "It sits at the center of that opportunity." Daniel opened the envelope and turned the paper toward him. The number was printed in bold near the bottom. $475,000. Nathan stared at it long enough for the room to go quiet around him. It was an almost absurd amount of money to see beside a coffee stain and a crooked stack of napkins. Enough to buy a small house outside town. Enough to fix Atlas's hip properly, not just manage it with careful walks and postponed appointments. Enough to stop counting every dollar twice. Enough, maybe, to become a man who did not wake up already tired from surviving. Daniel let the silence work. Good salesmen knew when not to talk. Nathan wished he did not understand that. "We'd preserve the Bellamy name in some way," Daniel added gently. "Maybe a plaque, a mural, something tasteful." Nathan looked at Margaret's photograph on the wall, her flour-dusted apron, her tired, kind smile. Something tasteful. It sounded like putting flowers on a grave you had dug yourself. "What would you build?" "A mixed-use retail space. Clean design, national tenants, more jobs, more tax revenue." Nothing in his voice was cruel. That was the hardest part. Daniel was not a villain. He was a man doing what the world had trained him to do. Measure worth by square footage, revenue, visibility, growth. Nathan had done his own measuring in life. Miles marched, vitals checked, rent due, hours worked, pain hidden. He knew numbers could be honest. He also knew they could leave out everything that mattered. Before he could answer, the bell rang. Sam Ortega stepped halfway inside, saw Daniel, saw the papers, and stopped. Something in his face closed, not anger, not fear, just the quiet resignation of a man who had watched good places vanish under better lighting. "Sorry," Sam said. "Didn't mean to interrupt." "You're not," Nathan replied. Sam's eyes moved to the offer, then to the old tables, the paperback shelf, Atlas by the door. Margaret used to say buildings remember how people treated each other inside them. He gave a small shrug, embarrassed by his own tenderness. Anyway, back sinks holding fine. He left before Nathan could speak. The bell trembled behind him. Daniel folded his hands. "I understand sentiment, Mr. Brooks, truly. But sentiment won't repair the roof." Nathan looked again at the number. $475,000. Clean, round, merciful, tempting. Atlas rose then, slow and deliberate, walked behind the counter, and nudged the lower shelf with his nose. The kindness ledger slid out just enough for its cracked leather cover to show. Nathan stared at it. No charge. Let them keep their dignity. The words were not written on the page before him, but he heard them anyway. Daniel waited. Nathan placed one hand on the ledger and the other on the offer. For the first time since arriving in Laurel Bend, he understood that a choice could be generous and selfish at the same time, frightening and right in the same breath. "I'll think about it," he said. Daniel nodded. "That's all I ask." But after the man left, Nathan did not move for a long while. Outside, Magnolia Street went on with its ordinary morning. Inside, the bakery held its breath, and Atlas stood beside Nathan as if guarding not a building, but the small, stubborn part of him that still wanted to believe some things were worth more than being sold. The rain came in just after lunch, soft at first, then steady enough to silver the sidewalks and turn Magnolia Street into a blurred watercolor of red brick, green awnings, and passing headlights. Nathan had always liked rain more than silence. Rain gave a man something outside himself to listen to. It tapped against the bakery windows, whispered through the gutters, and softened the town until even the empty tailor shop next door looked forgiven. Business slowed, which suited him. He moved through the kitchen with a damp towel over one shoulder, pretending to organize shelves while the offer from Daniel Kessler sat folded beneath the register like a second heartbeat. $475,000. A number that kept returning no matter how many times Nathan pushed it away. Atlas had been restless since morning, not anxious, searching. He moved from the front door to the counter, from the counter to the kitchen, then stopped near the old brick oven built into the back wall. Nathan watched him circle once, lower his nose, and sniff along a narrow wooden panel beside the oven frame. "What is it now?" Nathan asked. Atlas pressed his paw gently against the panel. Nothing happened. He pressed again, more firmly, then looked back with that steady old patience that always made Nathan feel like the younger creature in the room. "You know," Nathan said, reaching for the toolbox Sam had left under the sink, "most dogs bring their people sticks." The panel was held by two small screws painted over so carefully they nearly disappeared. Nathan worked them loose while the rain thickened beyond the kitchen window. The wood came away with a sigh of dust. Behind it was a shallow space between brick and beam, and inside that space sat a white envelope sealed with blue wax. His name was written across the front, Nathan Brooks. Not Mr. Brooks, not to whom it may concern. Nathan Brooks in Margaret Bellamy's hand. For a moment, the kitchen seemed to tilt around him. Atlas sat beside his leg, close but not touching, as if giving him the dignity of choosing when to be steadied. Nathan broke the seal. Inside was a letter, 4 pages folded neatly, and a small photograph clipped to the top. The photograph showed the front of Bellamy's hearth on a rainy evening 4 years earlier. On the bench beneath the awning sat a man in a dark jacket, head lowered, one hand resting on the back of a German shepherd. Nathan knew the jacket, knew the curve of those shoulders, knew the dog. He sat down before his knees could betray him. The letter began without decoration. "Dear Nathan, if you are reading this, then Atlas has probably found what I hid. I suspected he would. Some souls are better at finding buried things than people are." Nathan swallowed hard and kept reading. Margaret wrote that 4 years ago, on a June evening heavy with rain, she had seen him sitting outside the bus station across from the bakery. He had looked exhausted, soaked through, and determined not to ask anyone for anything. Atlas had been younger then, ribs lean beneath wet fur, his head resting on Nathan's boot. Margaret had brought out a paper bag with bread, a cup of coffee, and a clean towel for the dog. Nathan remembered the towel first. Strange how memory chooses its own door. He remembered a woman's voice saying, "You don't have to explain pain to earn kindness." He had thought of her sometimes afterward, but only as a passing mercy on a hard night. He had not known her name. He had not known she had watched him open the bag, take out the warm roll, and tear it in half before taking a single bite, giving the first piece to Atlas with the seriousness of a man keeping a promise. Margaret's next lines blurred before he blinked them clear. "I chose you because even when you looked forgotten by the world, you remembered someone smaller than your own hunger. That told me enough. Bellamy's hearth does not need a perfect man. It needs a man who understands dignity, because he knows what it feels like to almost lose his own. Nathan set the letter down. Rain ran along the window in crooked lines. The oven ticked softly as the old building settled around him. Atlas laid his head across Nathan's knee then, no command, no demand, only presence. Nathan placed his hand over the dog's graying muzzle and closed his eyes. He had come to Laurel Bend believing a stranger had burdened him with bricks, debt, and sentiment. But Margaret had not been a stranger. Not entirely. She had been the woman from the rain. The one who had offered help without questions, warmth without ownership, kindness without making him stand smaller to receive it. And now, years later, she had reached across death with one final act of trust. Not because Nathan had saved anyone. Not because he had earned a monument. Because on one forgotten evening, when he had almost nothing, he had still shared what little warmth he had. Nathan carried Margaret's letter in his jacket pocket for 3 days before he answered Daniel Kessler. He did not reread it in public. Some words deserved privacy. But he felt the shape of the folded pages every time he reached for his keys, every time he counted the cash drawer, every time Atlas limped a little after lying too long on the bakery floor. $475,000 still sat in his mind like a clean road out. He could see it clearly. A small house with a fenced yard, a better veterinarian, a truck that started on the first try. Mornings that did not begin with repair estimates and tax forms. It was not greed that tempted him. It was rest. That was harder to argue with. On Monday morning, he met Daniel at the lawyer's office above the bank. A square room with blinds half closed against the Tennessee sun, and a conference table, polished to a shine no one had earned by hand. Daniel was already there, suit jacket folded over a chair, papers arranged neatly before him. The lawyer, Marlene Price, gave Nathan a careful smile, the kind people offered when they hoped a man had slept before making a life-size decision. Atlas lay beside Nathan's chair, calm but watchful. "We can make this very simple," Daniel said. "No pressure, no theatrics. If you sign today, funds can transfer by Friday." Nathan nodded. He appreciated the honesty. Daniel was not pretending this was about community anymore. It was about money, timing, and land. Clean things, measurable things. Nathan looked at the contract. His name waited at the bottom of the page, one signature away from becoming the kind of man who had done the sensible thing. For a long moment, he could almost forgive himself for it. Then he thought of Earl holding coffee with both hands. Ruth saying neighbors worked that way. Sam saying work had saved him from embarrassment. Grace placing books by the door like second chances. He thought of the postal worker tasting his ugly cinnamon bread and saying it tasted like somebody tried. Last, he thought of Margaret in the rain, handing warmth to a stranger without asking him to perform gratitude. Nathan took the pen. Daniel leaned back slightly. Marlene held her breath. Atlas lifted his head. Nathan clicked the pen once, then set it down across the unsigned line. "I can't sell it." The room stayed still. Daniel's face did not harden, but something practical in it closed. "Mr. Brooks, sentiment is admirable, but this building needs more than good memories. I know." Nathan rested one hand on Atlas's head. "That's why I'm not keeping it as a memory." Marlene's eyebrows rose. "What are you planning?" Nathan pulled a folded sheet from his pocket. It was not Margaret's letter, but his own notes, messy and crossed out, written over 3 late nights at the bakery counter. "Bellamy's Hearth reopens next month. Small menu, coffee, bread, simple lunches. I'll lease the back room twice a week for support meetings and job workshops. Quiet ones. No posters in the window calling anybody broken." Daniel looked unconvinced. Nathan kept going. "There'll be a pay-it-forward board, but no names. Nobody gets announced as needy. Nobody has to tell their story to earn soup. If people want to cover someone's meal, they can. If someone needs one, they ask for the daily special. That's it." Marlene smiled then, slowly. "The daily special. Margaret was better at lying kindly than I am," Nathan said. "I'm learning." Daniel tapped the contract once with his finger. "That won't fix the roof." "No," Nathan said. "But Sam knows a roofer. Earl knows a retired accountant. Ruth knows everybody, and I know how to work." It sounded simple when he said it. It was not. He was afraid. Afraid of debt, failure, mornings when the oven refused to light, evenings when the place emptied and doubt sat in every chair. But fear did not always mean turn back. Sometimes it only meant the road mattered. Daniel gathered his papers with professional grace. "I hope you understand what you're turning down." Nathan looked out the window toward Magnolia Street, where the bakery's faded sign was just visible between the trees. For the first time in a while, he said, "I think I do." That afternoon, Nathan took the closed sign from the front window and set it on the counter. He did not throw it away. He turned it over and wrote on the back in black marker, "Opening soon. Coffee is $2. Conversation is still free." Atlas sat beside him, flour dusting his nose from a bag he had investigated without permission. Nathan laughed before he could stop himself, and the sound startled him with its honesty. Outside, Laurel Bend moved through the warm afternoon. Inside, Bellamy's hearth began quietly to become less of a place Nathan had inherited and more of a promise he had chosen. The reopening of Bellamy's hearth did not look like a grand event from the outside. There were no balloons tied to the door, no bright banners stretched across Magnolia Street, no speeches written on index cards. Nathan had refused all of that with the same quiet stubbornness he used to refuse extra sugar in his coffee. Instead, he washed the windows until the late afternoon light came through clean, swept the front step twice, and placed one small chalkboard near the entrance. It read, "Bellamy's hearth is open again. Come in as you are." By 5 o'clock, the bakery smelled of cinnamon bread, black coffee, lemon glaze, and warm yeast. Ruth had brought flowers from her backyard and put them in mason jars on the tables. Earl had repaired the old wall clock, though he set it 3 minutes slow because, as he explained, a place like this should never rush anybody. Grace arranged paperbacks on the shelf by the door. Sam fixed the porch light so its amber glow spilled gently across the sidewalk. Nobody called it charity. Nobody called it community work. They just came and did what needed doing, which Nathan was beginning to understand was one of the holiest languages people could speak. Atlas lay near the entrance wearing no vest, no sign, no title, but somehow every person who entered greeted him first. "Evening, manager?" Earl said, bending carefully to scratch behind the shepherd's ear. Atlas accepted the respect with professional dignity, then sneezed because flour dust had settled on his nose. Nathan laughed, and this time the sound did not surprise him as much. The room filled slowly, not crowded, just alive. Cups touched saucers. Chairs scraped softly against the old floor. Someone asked for the daily special, and Nathan served soup with bread, without changing his voice, without lowering his eyes, without turning kindness into an announcement. A man in a mechanic's shirt paid for 2 coffees and only drank 1. A woman left $5 under the pay-it-forward jar with her fingers pressed flat against the bill, as if leaving gratitude there too. Near the window, the table with the carved words sat occupied by a gray-haired man Nathan had seen once or twice near the bus station. He wore a clean but faded jacket and held his hat in both hands before sitting down, like he was asking permission from the room itself. Nathan recognized that posture. The carefulness of someone who had been turned away enough times to enter every warm place ready to leave. Nathan did not ask what he needed. He did not ask where he had been. He sliced a thick piece of cinnamon bread, placed it on a plate, and set it before him with a cup of coffee. "First night back," Nathan said. Margaret always believed a bakery should make too much on purpose." The man looked up, and something fragile moved across his face. "I can pay." "I didn't say you couldn't." Nathan nodded toward the cup. "Coffee's $2. Bread's a reopening mistake." The man's mouth trembled before it became a smile. "Then I appreciate your mistake." Atlas rose and walked over, lowering himself beside the man's chair without touching him. The man rested one hand lightly on the shepherd's head, and for a while they stayed that way, 2 quiet creatures letting the room hold them. Then, after taking one bite, the man looked across to the next table, where a woman in a grocery store uniform sat alone, rubbing tired circles into her wrist. Without making a show of it, he broke the slice of cinnamon bread in half, placed the larger piece on a napkin, and slid it toward her. "He made too much," he said softly. The woman looked at the bread, then at him, then at Nathan. She accepted it with a nod that held more dignity than words could have carried. Nathan stood behind the counter, unable to move. The whole room continued around him, ordinary and sacred at once. Rain began outside, light and warm, tapping the awning like fingers remembering an old song. Atlas looked back at Nathan, brown eyes steady, as if he had known all along that this was where the trail had been leading. Nathan reached into his pocket and touched Margaret's letter, folded thin from being carried close. He finally understood. Margaret had not left him a bakery because she needed a building saved. She had left him a doorway, a way back to people, a place where respect could be served warm, where help could arrive without shame, where a man who once believed he had nothing left to offer could learn that his hands still knew how to build shelter. Later that night, after the last cup was washed and the last chair turned down from the tables, Nathan stood beneath Margaret's photograph. "We opened," he said quietly. The woman in the frame smiled her tired, flour-dusted smile. Atlas leaned against Nathan's leg. Outside, Laurel Bend glowed in the soft rain. Inside Bellamy's hearth, the old clock ticked 3 minutes slow, the ovens cooled, and the scent of cinnamon lingered in the walls like a promise refusing to leave. If this story touched you, give it a like and subscribe for more heartfelt stories about loyalty, second chances, and the quiet ways kindness finds us. Tell me in the comments which moment stayed with you the most and where you're watching from tonight.